3,370 feet. That is the exact elevation where Glen Canyon Dam simply stops working, not runs dry. Stops working. Below that line, called dead pool, water sits trapped because the outlet works can no longer release it by gravity. In April 2023, Lake Powell came within 30 feet of losing hydropower completely, the closest this dam has gotten to that failure since it filled in the 1960s. Officials called it a drought crisis. I work in reservoir operations, and drought is the smaller part of this story. The real failure was poured into concrete in 1963. And here's a small detail that tells you how messy the record keeping around this dam actually is. The number everyone quotes for dead pool, 3,370 feet, matches the intake elevation of the river outlet works. But the United States Geological Survey ran its own elevation area capacity survey of the reservoir in 2018, and it places the equivalent dead storage bench slightly higher at 3,372.91 feet. That's not a huge gap. It's a couple of feet. But when your entire crisis narrative hangs on a single elevation number, and two federal data sources don't agree on it to the foot, that tells you something about how loosely this system has actually been tracked over the decades. Below either version of that line, the reservoir doesn't vanish. Roughly 2 million acre-feet of water would still sit there, stranded behind the dam, rising and falling only with inflow, evaporation, and seepage, completely unusable for downstream delivery or power. That's not an empty canyon. That's dead weight. Here's what the drought story leaves out. This decline was never a surprise. From 2000 to 2020, unregulated inflow into Lake Powell averaged just 8.62 million acre-feet a year. That's roughly 80% of the 1981 to 2010 average. Reclamation had that number. Basin states had that number. This wasn't a flash flood of bad news. It was a slow, tracked, modeled decline that showed up in federal reports for 2 decades before anyone treated it like an emergency. So when officials stand up and call this a drought crisis, I don't disagree. I just think crisis implies surprise, and this was never a surprise. This was a spreadsheet. Okay, so if it wasn't sudden, why does it feel sudden now? Because the dam has a design ceiling, and in April 2023, the reservoir finally scraped up against it. Lake Powell hit 3,519.92 feet, the lowest elevation since the reservoir first filled in the 1960s. That's about 30 feet above minimum power pool, the point where the turbines have to shut down entirely to avoid sucking air into the penstocks. 30 feet sounds like a cushion. In reservoir terms, that's not a cushion. That's a margin so thin that one bad snowpack year away, this dam stops making power completely. Let's put a number on what that 30-foot margin actually costs, because cushion is doing a lot of vague work in that sentence. Reclamation has stated that every additional foot of decline at Lake Powell cost the dam about 3 megawatts of generating capacity. Not eventually, immediately. And this isn't a new squeeze. In the decade before the current drought began in 2000, this power plant averaged around 4,600 gigawatt hours of generation a year. By early 2023, capacity had already fallen to roughly 59% of the dam's rated nameplate output, about 778 megawatts. Some of that is the water level. Some of it is the 1992 Grand Canyon Protection Act, which restricts how hard operators can run the turbines to protect downstream ecology, cutting off the option to just squeeze more peaking power out of what's left. So you've got less water, a shrinking head of pressure behind the turbines, and legal restrictions on running them harder to compensate. 3 separate constraints, all tightening at the same time, and all 3 predate this week's headlines by years. And here's the detail that should bother you more than the elevation number itself. That 20-foot gap between the hydropower penstocks and minimum power pool was not set by some unchangeable law of hydraulics. A 2023 reclamation presentation acknowledged that gap exists largely to prevent vortex formation at the intakes, and that it could potentially be reduced with vortex suppressing structures. Read that again. The buffer that is shutting down hydropower years earlier than it strictly has to may be a modifiable engineering choice, not an unchangeable physical law. Nobody has built that retrofit. As of this recording, it is a line in a slide deck, not a structure in the dam. Now let us back up to why this dam was ever allowed to be built this thin on margin in the first place, because that goes back further than 1963. The legal entitlements every basin state draws from the Colorado River trace back to the 1922 Colorado River Compact, which divided up the river's water based on flow measurements taken during an unusually wet handful of years. Later hydrology work has made it clear those early measurements overestimated how much water the river actually delivers in a typical year, which means the entire allocation system downstream of that compact was built on optimistic paper math from the start. Tree ring reconstructions published in Nature Climate Change found that the period from 2000 to 2021 was the driest 22-year stretch in the American Southwest in roughly 1,200 years, and that human-caused warming made the shortfall meaningfully worse. So you have got a dam engineered around 1922's optimistic paper water operating through the driest generation in over a millennium. That is not one design flaw. That is a design built on top of an accounting error, aging through a climate nobody in 1922 or 1963 planned for. I'll be fair here, because I don't want to make this sound like nobody saw this coming. People saw it coming. In August 2022, Zach Frankel at the Utah Rivers Council was already telling anyone who'd listen that Glen Canyon Dam physically cannot meet downstream water demand once levels drop below the hydropower penstocks. That same year, 3 environmental groups, the Great Basin Water Network, the Glen Canyon Institute, and the Utah Rivers Council, published a joint report bluntly titled "Around the Dam's Aging Plumbing and Postponed Leadership." The whole argument of that report was that the river outlet works, the backup system below the turbines, were never built to handle sustained, low-level releases. It's worth knowing this wasn't the first time reclamation tried this maneuver either. High-flow experiments had already been run in November 2012, 2013, 2014, 2016, and 2018, all timed for the fall, all using the same basic logic of flushing sediment down through the Grand Canyon to rebuild beaches. The April 2023 release was the first time the agency ever attempted one of these in spring instead of fall, and the first time one was run with the reservoir sitting this close to minimum power pool. So this wasn't an untested tool suddenly deployed in a crisis. It was a well-established tool used 5 times without this kind of structural damage, then run a 6th time under conditions nobody had tested it against, and it broke. So when the crisis hit in spring 2023, it wasn't a new discovery. It was an old warning finally colliding with reality. That's not drought. That's a monitoring gap between what engineers knew and what got funded. Now here's where the story gets uncomfortable, because the fix that was supposed to protect the ecosystem is the same fix that damaged the dam. In late April 2023, Reclamation ran what's called a high-flow experiment, sending releases as high as 39,500 cubic feet per second through the dam over about 3 days. The goal was legitimate. It moves sediment down through the Grand Canyon, rebuilds eroding beaches, and supports the habitat native fish depend on. During that release, roughly 3,500 cubic feet per second moved specifically through the river outlet works, the low backup pipes near the base of the dam, for about 72 hours straight. Here's why that detail matters, and it's not trivia. Those outlet pipes sit lower in the reservoir, closer to where water levels were already thin. When you push high-velocity water through pipes at low reservoir elevation, you create the physical conditions for cavitation. That's not a guess. That's basic fluid mechanics. Cavitation happens when fast-moving water creates air bubbles near the pipe surface, and those bubbles collapse violently enough to generate shock waves that pit and erode steel from the inside. David Wegner, a former reclamation engineer who spent 20 years working on Glen Canyon issues, has been blunt about it. Those shock waves are powerful enough to damage steel outright, and that's exactly what an inspection found after the 2023 release. Erosion, pitting, damage inside the 4 outlet pipes. A reclamation official, Nick Williams, said publicly that this wasn't caused by one single event, that it built up over time and becomes more likely specifically when reservoir levels are low, which is the part I want you to sit with for a second. The mechanism that damages this dam gets worse exactly when the dam needs its backup system the most. Low water doesn't just threaten hydropower, it actively erodes the emergency plumbing meant to compensate for low water. So what did Reclamation do about it? They relined the pipes. A year-long, $8.9 million project stripped out coal tar coating, that had been sitting inside those outlet works for more than 60 years and replaced it with an epoxy primer and a polysiloxane top coat. And to be fair, that project reportedly finished early and under budget. Good project management. I'm not knocking the contractors. But listen to how Reclamation itself described what that project actually fixes. They stated plainly that relining will not prevent the risk of additional cavitation when operating at low reservoir levels. Read that sentence slowly. The multi-million-dollar fix everybody read about in headlines does not solve the problem that caused the damage in the first place. It solves corrosion. It doesn't solve cavitation. Those are two completely different failure modes, and only one of them got addressed. Wayne Pullen, Reclamation's Upper Colorado Basin Regional Director, framed the relining work as fulfilling the agency's duty to operate the dam safely and maintain reliable water deliveries. That's a very diplomatic way to describe repainting a pipe without fixing the reason the pipe got damaged. I don't think that's dishonest. I think it's the kind of sentence that sounds reassuring in a press release and sounds like an admission once you understand what cavitation actually is. Now here's a twist that goes beyond plumbing, because the same low water conditions that are eroding the outlet pipes are also messing with the ecosystem. Those releases are supposed to protect. When Lake Powell drops, the water Reclamation releases through the dam gets pulled from a shallower, warmer layer of the reservoir instead of the cold water deep underneath. Warmer water passing downstream has helped invasive smallmouth bass establish populations below the dam. That matters because smallmouth bass eat native fish, including the threatened humpback chub and the endangered razorback sucker. So Reclamation now runs what they call cool mix flows, deliberately routing colder water from deeper in the reservoir once average river temperatures near the dam hit about 60 degrees Fahrenheit for 3 straight days. That's a second improvised system stacked on top of the first improvised system, both trying to compensate for a dam that was never designed to operate this way at this elevation. This is where I'd usually expect the story to wrap up neatly. It doesn't, because the tool that's supposed to fix everything, the high flow experiment, might not even be usable anymore when it's needed. A March 2024 internal memo from Reclamation stated there wasn't sufficient sediment built up to justify running another high flow experiment in spring 2024. Sediment has to accumulate in Marble Canyon before that flushing release is worth doing. So the tool that rebuilds beaches and disrupts invasive fish habitat is currently sidelined, partly because using it damaged the very pipes it depends on, and partly because there isn't enough material downstream to justify running it again yet. And that same memo, authored by Richard LaFond, director of Reclamation's Technical Service Center, said something that I think is the real thesis buried in a government document. He wrote that nothing in Glen Canyon Dam's design references indicates the river outlet works were ever intended for long-term water conveyance at low reservoir levels. Let that sink in. The emergency backup pipes people are now depending on to keep water and power flowing were never designed to be a primary system. They were designed as a relief valve, not a lifeline. And right now, they're being asked to be a lifeline. That's not a conspiracy. That's an engineering memo quietly admitting the dam's backup plan was never meant to be the plan. I want to be fair about the technology itself, because I don't think the outlet works are fake or useless. They're legitimate infrastructure doing a job they weren't built for. This is the same pattern I see across a lot of badly aging water and dam systems. A component that works fine under normal design conditions gets pushed into duty under conditions nobody planned for, and then people act shocked when it starts failing. The outlet works aren't broken by incompetence. They're broken by mismatch. Depth mismatch, specifically. And no amount of epoxy changes that mismatch. So where does that leave the actual fix? The one that would solve the elevation problem instead of patching around it? Reclamation has floated 3 real engineering options. One is a new, lower intake tied into the existing turbines, which would let the dam pull water from what's currently dead pool territory. Reclamation's own materials note that option carries increased risk, specifically because it means penetrating through the dam structure itself, which is not a small thing to attempt on a 710-foot concrete dam holding back millions of acre-feet of water. The second option connects new power generation equipment directly to the river outlet works. The third is the most dramatic, tunneling through the canyon wall to build an entirely new underground power station, which would also give operators more flexibility on releases generally. There's a fourth option on the table too, and it's the one that tells you how seriously people inside this field are taking the mismatch. Some scientists, including Zana Stutz at the Glen Canyon Institute, have proposed something more radical than any retrofit, draining Lake Powell entirely and routing the river through bypass tunnels drilled around the base of the dam, letting the Colorado run essentially free through what is now a reservoir, while keeping the dam itself in place purely as emergency storage. That would end hydropower generation at this site permanently. Nobody is pretending that's a small ask, but the fact that a full drawdown is even being discussed in serious policy circles instead of being laughed out of the room tells you how far outside its original operating envelope this dam has already drifted. When abandoning the core function of the facility becomes a legitimate item on the table, that's not really a debate about engineering options anymore. That's a debate about whether the original premise still holds. None of these have been built. None of them are funded to completion as of this recording. They exist as engineering options in a slide deck and a technical memo, the same place that vortex suppression idea has been sitting. This is the part that bothers me professionally, because none of these options are secret and none of them are moving at the speed the reservoir is dropping. Zana Stutz, program director at the Glen Canyon Institute, has framed the core problem about as bluntly as I've heard anyone in this space put it. She's argued the dam has effectively become a bottleneck, physically sitting on top of roughly 6 million acre-feet of water that the current outlet structure simply cannot reach. That's not a hypothetical volume. That's real water, sitting behind a wall that was built without a true low-level release path in the first place, and this doesn't stay contained to the reservoir. When federal hydropower generation at this dam drops, its preference customers, mostly publicly owned utilities, and rural electric cooperatives that buy power at cost through the Western Area Power Administration have to replace that supply somewhere else, usually at higher cost. Reclamation and outside analysts have flagged the downstream effects as higher electricity prices for those customers, increased reliability risk on the regional grid, and higher greenhouse gas emissions as utilities lean on other generation sources to cover the gap. The dam's overall share of the regional grid is small enough that these effects don't reshape the entire Western power market by themselves. But for the specific communities plugged into this specific power contract, a foot of reservoir decline isn't an abstraction. It's a line item on somebody's utility bill. And here's where the human stakes stop being abstract. This dam's operation touches roughly 25 million people downstream who depend on Colorado River deliveries, plus billions of dollars in agriculture, plus every hydropower customer on the grid that draws from this plant, plus the entire downstream ecosystem in the Grand Canyon that depends on scheduled releases to manage sediment, temperature, and native fish survival. When people talk about Lake Powell like it's a scenic reservoir story, they're missing that this is simultaneously a water supply story, a power grid story, and an endangered species story, all bottlenecked through the same aging concrete structure. And I want to bring this current because this isn't a story that resolved itself after 2023. As of this recording, Lake Powell is sitting at roughly a quarter full. Water year 2026 has been one of the worst inflow years on record for this reservoir, with unregulated inflow tracking at only about 34% of average. Reclamation's own projections show the lake ending this water year near 3,510.85 feet, which would sit below the 2023 record low. To slow that slide, the agency cut its scheduled release to 6.0 million acre-feet, the lowest its current operating rules allow, and it's pulling an additional 660,000 to 1 million acre-feet down from Flaming Gorge Reservoir upstream through April of 2027, essentially borrowing water from one reservoir to prop up another. Every fix I've walked you through so far, the relining, the cool mix flows, the interim cavitation guidance, is still in place right now, in 2026, while the lake threatens to set a new record low anyway. That's the clearest evidence I can give you that none of this has actually solved the underlying mismatch. It's bought time. Time is not the same thing as a fix. I keep coming back to one detail because I think it's the cleanest explanation for why every proposed solution keeps under-delivering. Glen Canyon Dam was designed and built in the early 1960s, in an era of assumed abundance. Engineers weren't planning around scarcity. They weren't planning around a 22-year drought that tree ring records now show is the driest stretch the region has seen in roughly 1,200 years. They built a structure that stores water beautifully and releases water only down to a certain point because nobody seriously modeled a future where the reservoir would sit at a quarter full for years at a stretch. That assumption is baked into the concrete. You cannot engineer your way around a design ceiling with a maintenance contract. You can only engineer your way around it by changing the structure itself, and that hasn't happened yet. Which brings me to what a properly managed system would have looked like instead. If I were advising on this, standard of care wouldn't be wait for the crisis and then coat the pipes. Standard of care means building the low-level intake before you're 30 feet from losing power generation, not after. It means treating vortex suppression and cavitation risk as design problems to be solved in advance, not operational surprises to react to after an inspection finds pitting in steel. It means funding the retrofit at the same urgency level as the press release announcing the temporary fix. Right now, what we have is politics and public messaging moving at press release speed, while the actual engineering moves at grant cycle speed. Those two speeds do not match the speed of a reservoir falling toward minimum power pool. I also want to flag what we genuinely don't know yet, because I think the honesty matters more than the outrage. We don't have a confirmed public timeline for when, or if, any of those three retrofit options gets fully funded and built. We don't know exactly how much additional cavitation risk accumulates with each future low-level release, because reclamation itself is still testing that using small-scale physical models at its technical service center in Denver. That's not me being coy. That's the actual state of the evidence right now. The uncertainty here isn't a gap in reporting, it's a gap in the engineering answer itself, and that gap is what should worry you more than a scary headline number. Because here's the theme underneath everything I've walked you through. This was never really a story about drought outrunning a reservoir. It's a story about a structure that had a known design limitation, documented warnings 2 decades old, a temporary maintenance fix that explicitly does not address the underlying failure mode, and an emergency ecological tool that damaged its own delivery system the one time conditions forced it to run at the edge. Every one of those pieces was knowable in advance. None of them were hidden. They were sitting in agency reports, environmental group publications, and internal reclamation memos the whole time. I am not shocked this happened. Water systems fail exactly like this, in slow, documented, entirely foreseeable ways, and then everyone acts surprised on the day the number finally crosses the line someone flagged years earlier. What actually shocks me is watching officials describe a repainted pipe as a solution when their own engineers already told them, on paper, that repainting doesn't touch the actual problem. So here's where this really leaves us. Zana Stutz asked the obvious question out loud. Why was this dam built? And is it still doing that job? Her own answer was no. I think that's fair. This structure was built to store abundance and generate power off the back of a river that no longer reliably delivers either at the volumes 1960s engineers assumed. Everything since 2000 has been managing around that mismatch instead of correcting it. The outlet pipes are relined now. They're shiny, epoxy-coated, under warranty, and finished ahead of schedule. Good for the contractors. But the elevation of Deadpool hasn't moved a single foot. The design ceiling nobody built past in 1963 is still exactly where it was. The plumbing got repainted, the ceiling is still there, and the next time this reservoir drops toward that line, it won't be a surprise either. It'll just be the same warning, arriving on schedule, to people who already had the memo.